You're listening to How to Win Friends and Save the Republic, a podcast from the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. I'm your host, Andy Moore. Welcome to the program, Josh Silver.
Thanks. Good to be here, Andy.
We're super excited to have you. Josh, I feel like from my point of view, you are one of the OGs in the democracy reform space, that your name and your organizations have been around from the time that those terminologies were just starting to be used. And so I kind of want to know a little bit about your background, specifically, like, how did you get involved in this work? How do you come to democracy reform and fighting corruption in our politics?
Sure. But I will say, by saying I'm the OG in the democracy reform space, when compared to, say, issues like the environment or healthcare or women's rights, it's a little like saying you're like the best bobsled team in Jamaica, right? I mean, this is still a small movement, but I appreciate the shout out. I started in the mid to late 90s when I had a conversation with someone whom I respect a ton, who basically said, hey, it all comes down to democracy, campaign finance, elections. Like, the incentives are skewed. And this is way back. This is like 96, 97. And until we change the rules of our politics, we are going to continue to see incentives that skew politicians towards enriching their campaign contributors and special interests, and not the American people. And that was the starting point. Worked on some ballot initiatives. Democracy reform efforts kind of stalled in the year 2000. There's some big ballot initiative defeats that a lot of people don't know about that happened in places like Oregon and Missouri. And then I went to the other side of the same coin, which is fighting for journalism and an information marketplace that enables citizens to be informed with facts and participants in a vibrant democracy. So I really do think that's an important point. Like, you've got democracy reform is critical because you need politicians who actually care about the interests of their constituents, and media reform and journalism is essential because you need citizens who actually know what's going on and can make informed decisions with which they can participate in that democracy. Started a group called Free Press, which for a while was the largest media reform group in the country, working on things like media consolidation, funding for journalism, public broadcasting, et cetera. But always felt like my heart was really in democracy. And after Citizens United, with the sort of huge surge in public awareness about the democracy problem, while virtually every single organization working on democracy was decidedly liberal, I just saw these statistics that just blew my mind. Number one, at the time, only 22% of Americans self-identified as liberal, but vast majorities of American liberal, moderate, and conservative support a broad range of democracy reforms like open primaries and anti-gerrymandering and campaign finance. And I saw the need to create an organization which became Represent Us, that talks to everybody, that enlists support from all Americans, regardless of political ideology, in the fight for American democracy.
Yeah, I think you hit on a couple of really important things there. One is I love the fact that the acknowledgement that transparency in our government is vital to the success of our democracy, in the same ways that some of the, changes to the electoral system, voting rights, those things that we talk about more right now, that if we don't have access to know what's happening, then some of the outside things are, they just happen in the dark, and it's harder to know what to fix. And then secondly, I think that cross-partisan or transpartisanship is a big deal. I mean, you mentioned Citizens United as being a bit of a flashpoint for yourself and for a lot of folks. How do you work so hard? I mean, obviously we're super divided right now. in our country on this like staunchly partisan lines. So how does Represent Us reach across to both sides of that aisle to bring folks together?
It's a great question, Andy. And I actually think that the aisle has changed. I think the axis has changed. The axis for generations has been liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. I think in 2021, that's kind of out the window. I think we're in a nation where 50% of us are independent voters, 25% are Democrats, and 25% are Republican. We're in a nation where 75% of Americans today do not self-identify as liberal. And we're in a nation where a large wing of one party, the Republican Party, has made assertive moves towards a Russian-style autocracy or a proto-fascist state, right? Where it's more akin to what you see with Vladimir Putin, where they have a democracy in name, but through voter suppression, through manipulation of news and information, and by rigging the rules, like in our case with things like gerrymandering, they are managing their democracy to predetermine outcomes. And so when you name the fact that a large majority of a political party in the United States, in this case the Republicans in 2021, are moving towards a Russian-style autocracy, that's just a fact. That's not a partisan gesture. That does not implicitly or explicitly endorse the other party, the Democrats, because it doesn't. It's just naming a massive seismic shift that has occurred in this country over the last 4 years under former President Trump. And it's something that we have to stop, because if we don't, we will see the end of American democracy. And as many constitutional historians and academics have pointed out, like Dan Zimblett and others in recent years, it can happen quickly. So it's an existential moment of reckoning where I would argue this is less about Democrats and Republicans uniting or liberals and conservatives uniting. And this is all Americans who support representative democracy, small d democracy, uniting against the forces of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, we see campaigns and just like general anti-political sentiment, right, among voters who just want to chalk it up and say that, they're all crooks. Everyone up there, everyone who runs for office is elected. But that's not necessarily the case, right?
No, but it is the case that the most powerful actors in both of the major parties in the current duopoly are under undue influence from the largest political benefactors. I would say today in 2021, the Republicans are worse, but the Democrats suffer from it broadly and compromise their policy positions on a regular basis because of the influence of big money and skewed elections systems. And that gets to why groups like Nanner and others and ours are so focused on policies that include and are not limited to open primaries and ranked choice voting in order to break open the political duopoly and introduce the same kind of competition that is so essential in the capitalistic commercial markets. The same is true for political markets. And until we break that duopoly and introduce real competition, we're going to continue to suffer.
Yeah, we visited with Rob Ritchie a couple of weeks ago from FairVote and discussed the recent Democratic primary election in New York City, where they used ranked choice voting on the largest scale that we've seen so far, and how overwhelmingly voters liked that. They liked that sense of choice, and they liked being able to be maybe more deeply engaged in the process, and I think it felt more fair to more people, which is what we're all working towards. If you have any thoughts on New York, we'd love to hear that. And also, just are there any other areas in the country that you think are making great strides towards building this more perfect union, this more effective democracy that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say New York is a bright spot. I think they had that hiccup, of course, that due to the Elections Commission, but that was not as big a deal as some made it. It worked well. Remember, we've got ranked choice voting working in 20 cities now in 2 U.S. states statewide. Maine and Alaska. My only peeve with New York is the fact that ranked choice voting does not apply to the general election there, and that needs to happen in the next opportunity, because still today, whoever wins in the primary, it's the Democrat who's going to win the general in the current system because of the winner take all model and the fact that it's an overwhelmingly big D Democratic city. So it just shows the importance of policy integrity. And I contend that New York the city was a huge victory for all advocates of election reform and ranked choice voting, but it could be better and it needs to get better. As far as bright spots around the country, Alaska is pretty remarkable, right? We've seen Alaska voters via the ballot initiative process, and even to some degree in the legislature, just make that a model state in terms of transparency of political donations, open primaries. It's top 4 open primaries with ranked choice voting. It's the only state to have that model of a top 4 or top 5 open primary with a ranked choice voting. We've seen in real time the way it has enabled Lisa Murkowski, the Republican senator from Alaska, to take even more moderated positions because she is less fearful. Because of ranked choice voting, she's less fearful of being so-called primaried from the right as she was in the last election, where a more extreme Republican won the GOP nomination and forced Senator Murkowski to run as a write-in, and remarkable that she succeeded in doing so. But she doesn't have to worry about that anymore because it is much, much more difficult to be primaried by extremists with a ranked choice voting system. So I'd say Alaska's the big bright spot now, and now we need to replicate that state and pass similar reforms in other model states.
Yeah. Do you think reforms like open primaries and ranked choice voting could have a positive impact on reducing that extremism on both sides?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the three big election or democracy related inputs that create extremism are gerrymandering, because it pushes all of the competition out of the general into the primary, where very few voters turn out and they're reliably the most partisan and extreme. And so politicians are structurally incentivized due to gerrymandering to appeal to the most radical wing of their primary voting base. The second is the winner take all system, because of the way that it sort of incentivizes combative, no holds barred, brutal attacks on the opponent, because all you're trying to do is just get more votes than them. You don't need to get the majority of votes. You don't need to get more than 50% of the votes. You just simply need more votes than your opponents in the primary or general, and that is conducive to extreme behavior. The third input is campaign finance, and when you're in the pocket of moneyed interests who want you to do things that are against the interest of the public, you are therefore incentivized to lie, to obfuscate, to attack, to draw attention away from the substance of what you're doing from a policy perspective, because it's deeply damaging and unpopular with the public. And you do better by attacking your opponents and playing the distraction game. And then, of course, on beyond the democracy policies, we just see this rampant disinformation that is lying to voters constantly. The most glaring example, of course, being that the 2020 election was stolen by Joe Biden and company, even though there's essentially no credible evidence to prove that. And when I say essentially, it's because there's tiny, tiny instances of voter fraud that are statistically irrelevant. And you have that on digital, which is propagating constantly everywhere in the billions, often funded and directed by foreign powers like Russia and China. And then you've got traditional media that's following in suit, where you've got the lies about things like election fraud propagating across Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax TV networks, and creating this bubble of lies that really resulted in things like the horrific days, the experience we saw on January 6th, 2021, the first successful violent invasion of the U.S. Capitol in 244 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure like you, I've been watching the hearings this week and hearing some of the stories from folks who were there, the police that were trying to protect the Capitol, and re-experiencing that in a whole new way. Now, one of the things that Represent Us also pushes against, aside from electoral reforms, is money in politics and the revolving door of politicians becoming lobbyists. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of that in ensuring a fair democracy?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable that we live in a country where it's literally legal to bribe the ref. I mean, those of you who understand sports know that it would be wholly inappropriate if the manager of the Red Sox goes out on the field and starts just handing cash to the umpires. Like, that's just not a good idea, because it's going to bias those umpires. It's the same things happening legally in politics every day, and it's pretty egregious. And when you consider that, for example, it's completely legal for a banking lobbyist to do a fundraiser for the chair of the finance committee that actually determines what laws banks are subject to. And then he or she then invites all these other banking lobbyists and banking executives, and they all write checks and they all go to the same event. And that candidate or politician is quite literally dependent on those contributions in order to win re-election. So he or she has no choice in the current system, which relies on private contributions into an election system that requires high levels of money in order to run ads and win. It's a system that is literally baked in corruption that requires quid pro quo transactions that will surely do engender corrupt quid pro quo results at every turn. And very often the corruption, the most egregious examples are not which laws pass. It's actually which laws are never even introduced, because the people who benefit from them are the poor or the sick or the elderly who don't have well-heeled lobbyists.
Yeah, I'm picturing a commercial that Represent Us might put out with a scene from a baseball stadium now, where you just watch the players go out and bribe the umpires. As that was a very visual analogy of exactly what happens. So what's the solution? I know you guys have been champions for the Anti-Corruption Act for a long time. Is that still on the table? Where are we with that?
Well, I mean, the Anti-Corruption Act is a menu. It's an a la carte menu from which we and other advocates have pulled key provisions for a decade. It's not that unlike the For the People Act, that there's a lot of similarities. The solution are, you've got financially based reforms that are important, and you have behavioral reforms that are important. So financial would be, for example, small dollar public funding of elections, so that candidates can actually draw money from a disinterested public pool should they be able to demonstrate real world public support, and use that money instead of private money. That's what they use in Europe. They use it in other developed democracies all around the world, and it works. And it's not a lot of money. So for those of you being like, how are we going to put tax money? It's scarcely any money at all. And the For the People Act that used to have that provision, it won't in the final version, didn't even take tax money. It uses it, gets the money from white collar criminals. Another one is the revolving door. So the behavioral is like, making it illegal for a politician to cash out and become a lobbyist within, say, 3 years of service for the government. That's really effective, because what you see today is more than 50% of members of Congress, they spin out of Congress, they're buddies with all the guys men and women making all the decisions, and they very quickly become lobbyists for banks, insurance companies, pharmaceuticals, et cetera. And there's loopholes. Even though it's technically not allowed for a year, they sign on as a senior strategic advisor for a lobbying shop, but effectively play the same role. And so it's laws like that can and should be passed to stop that. Now, I will say, if you back out the lens, election reforms like ranked choice voting and anti-gerrymandering have enjoyed a lot more success, momentum, philanthropic funding over the last 5 years, and with good reason, because they are passing more readily. There's a higher success rate. With campaign finance and ethics reform, there was a long kind of dark period from 1974, the last time anything major passed in the wake of Watergate, all the way up until today, where it was sort of one step forward, two steps back for campaign finance reform. That is, occasional victories, but public interest advocates largely were losing in those campaigns for those issues. And there became a lot of donor fatigue where the philanthropists just grew tired of funding losing campaigns. So we have to sort of dig our way out of that with better, more effective political strategies as we move forward and sort of reset and get campaign finance reform moving again.
Let's talk a little bit about the American Democracy Summit, which will be held this year, this October, I think 9th through 11th in Austin, Texas. This is the same event that some listeners may know as the Unrig Summit. Can you talk a little bit about what prompted the rebranding and what attendees might expect this year?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. And I will tell you, Andy, I hate to say it, but there is a possibility, we don't know, that the American Democracy Summit is going to have to be postponed because of the rapid rise of the Delta variant. As we're recording this podcast in the summer here of 2021, yesterday had the highest number of COVID cases that we've seen in a long time, a number higher than any day of the summer in 2020. Think about that. So that could be postponed. It's going to be smaller than the last Unrig Summit. It'll only be 2 rooms. It'll be about half the number of people, and this is because of the pandemic and our understanding that we're not going to have as high a turnout. But the rebrand is because we believe that Donald Trump is one of the most destructive forces for democracy, small d democracy, that our nation has ever seen. And he has been using this rhetoric of a rigged political system for years now, but it's the opposite of the truth. It's like, up is down, left is right, where he's calling a rigged system any system in which he loses. And it has skewed the debates enough that we feel like the Unrig Summit kind of gets skewed by that larger national narrative around Donald Trump, and we don't want it to. We want it to be simple and clear, and therefore we have embraced the American Democracy Summit.
That makes a lot of sense. That's exactly why we rebranded our podcast as well. It used to be called Unrig It, and now it's How to Win Friends and Save the Republic. Josh, as always, it has been a pleasure visiting with you.
Well, likewise, I'm really honored that you had me on the show. Thank you.
Listeners, you can find out more information about the American Democracy Summit at americandemocracysummit.org, and more information about Represent Us at their website, represent.us. Thanks for listening to How to Win Friends and Save the Republic. This podcast is a program of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. For more information about our organization and how you can join, please visit our website at nonpartisanreformers.org.